Hello, everyone, and it's that time again. Welcome to the Sidney St. James Show. We sure appreciate you dropping in. Believe it or not, people are tearing down George Washington statues. You know, this is Sidney St. James, and today's my subject matter is dear to my heart. One of my books, In the Face of Adversity, talks about my great-great-grandfather coming over from Germany and landing in the great state of Texas. In the novel, I talk about his performance in the Civil War and how he gave his life at the Battle of Vicksburg. I was proud of my great-grandfather fighting for his country. And it was his country at the time. It was the South. We had no say in it, the average citizen. So when I see and hear of them taking down Robert E. Lee's statue in downtown Richmond, Virginia, I had to jump on my computer and do a podcast about the last 2 years and all these statues being torn down and changing the name of stadiums and changing NFL teams' names, and it goes on and on. You know, I got to ask you this. Is Abraham Lincoln the next American historical personage to be canceled? Protesters in Portland tore down a statue of the venerated president, and some statues of him are now the targets for removal in other places. So you can ask yourself, why is Honest Abe so suddenly so dad-blasted controversial? Really now? First, I don't wish to sit here today and talk politics. This isn't why I'm here today. When I join friends, it is the only subject matter that makes for unpleasant conversation. But this particular part of so-called politics is destroying yours and my country. Do you understand my words? It is destroying our freedom, our country, the way we know how to live. So, I couldn't any longer leave the subject of what's going on lay quiet in my thoughts. So, I ask you today, my listeners, what do you think is actually driving this destruction of so much history in our country? These are groups of people who wish to destroy American history as a way to undermine the people's faith in the system we have here in our free America. My father, a well-known historian during his day on the Civil War, a sought-after speaker at many of the universities in Texas, was very pro Abe Lincoln, although being awarded the highest honors from the Daughters of the Confederacy. He was strongly with Lincoln that America is the last best hope on earth, a place where freedom exists and flourishes. I feel the same way as my father when I say that I think people who want a lot of government control of the populace don't like the symbols of that. Lincoln is one of those noblest symbols. I've stood quiet for so long, but now I'm more curious than ever what you think those people might be talking about with each other. A question pops into my head about just who in American history is acceptable to all those who are erasing our history. Stop and think about it. Just for a moment, please. One will realize that individual, whoever they might be, surely has faults as well, right? Let's take the founder of our country, George Washington. Growing up in our schools, his picture hung in Miss Mumford's second grade classroom. It also hung up in Mr. Sellers' fourth grade classroom, right behind the teacher, right next to the blackboard. I regard our first president as the most flawless American, the man we owe everything. Why? Why do we owe everything to this man? Well, because if you read about him, he fought so hard for this country and sacrificed so very much. Yes, it's true. It's a fact. George Washington owned slaves. But history will tell you he was opposed to slavery. As a matter of fact, he freed his slaves, but only after his wife died. In terms of his time period, he was so far ahead of his time, a very moral person with very self-sacrificing ways of life. Yet people are running all over our country right now, wanting to tear him down and take his picture off the walls of the classrooms. So for God's sake, it's more than these people and what they did. It's my honest opinion that it's an attempt to tear down the symbols of America. Period. So, when we talk about the study of history, in spite of all its flaws, what happens? Oh, I love history. As I've told you in some of my earlier podcasts, I'm a professional genealogist, and I have been for over 30 to 40 years. I do research day in and day out from the old archives of microfilm, which most now is digitized, by making my work much easier. Are we losing all sense of historical perspective? What it appears that people are doing is judging people back then by our contemporary standards. That doesn't seem quite right, does it? Let me ask all my Facebook friends who are listening. Have you ever looked down on your page and Facebook places something or a picture you put on Facebook 5 years ago, 10 years ago, or even more? It usually makes us smile with those memories, right? Well, I did just that with the Eagle Lake Headlight as a guest journalist and did historical memories for the paper. Had my own column. I did one such piece from 1887 about a big function at the Fraser Opera House down on the corner of 102 and Highway 90 alternate. Numerous people in town became alarmed when I did a reproduction of the journalistic piece that had the word darky in the article. It was a historical piece written by Jake Mansfield, who the dam in Austin is named after, who was a great congressman. Yes, but because he used the word darky in his article, and because he said darky in his article, do we judge him now and go knock down that dam and let the Colorado River flood all the lowlands all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico? No, we don't. It was just a historical piece, a piece of paper, some writing. After that particular article, I stopped writing for the columns in the paper. I stopped bringing back history in the paper and stopped my weekly contribution on this history in this small town 65 miles southwest of Houston. I think people judge people by the standards of their own time. Trust me when I say that everyone is flawed. Nobody's perfect. If you isolate something from the past, one doesn't always understand all the events that were going on in that time. Maybe a professional historian might, but now I have to go back and talk about Abe Lincoln again. He is the subject in a 6-novel series that I wrote called the Abraham Lincoln Assassination Series. The tall top-hat president didn't oppose slavery when he ran for president the very first time. He did, however, oppose its expansion, said it was immoral, but wanted to protect it where it existed. Where it's possible, people hate him for that, but he was at the forefront of his time in trying to say that slavery is wrong, and he didn't wish to expand it. It's very important to look at people in context. Of course, our country is not perfect. But when you step back and take a look at the sacrifices, many sacrifices, that were made to win us this incredible benefits we enjoy today, there's nothing more important than reading history and understanding that. In my 6-novel set, the research and writing of these books were enormous. And these books are all written in creative, historical nonfiction. I learned more about that time in my writing than I ever did studying a 1-week study course in college at A&M on the Civil War. There's a fella by the name of George Santayana, and he was a novelist too. And I looked up some quotes that he said, and he was born actually during the middle of the Civil War, and he died in 1952. He is popularly known for sayings such as, "Those who can't remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Another saying he had was, "Only the dead have seen the end of war." And lastly, by definition of beauty, he said, "It was pleasure objectified." I'm amazed at all the attempts around the country, and around the world for that matter, to remove and destroy painful mementos of our history. One would think that historical figures need to be perceived as perfect to survive these winds today of change that blow against these statues each and every day, or against these portraits that hang in the 2nd and 4th grade classrooms that I talked about earlier, not to mention the employment of their names. Some of these attempts are decent and civilized. However, some of them are misguided and downright violent. All, and I mean all, of it is unnecessary. When a statue is erected to a historical figure, the erection is a statement about the balance of that person's life's worth. It most definitely is not a claim of perfection. As I'm producing this podcast today, they are removing, right now as I speak, the statue of Robert E. Lee in downtown Richmond, Virginia. Now, think about it. Give me a break. The man broke from the North and remained with the South and fought for states' rights, something we are doing today. not slavery. And he was a great military man. And he was the boss of my great-great-grandfather who lost his life in the Civil War. Now, let's take George Washington. Yep, George Washington, the father of our country. George Washington, who was also the president, owned more than 100 slaves. When the United States Capitol was in Philadelphia, at the time when all slaves were deemed by Pennsylvania law to be freed after 6 months of their entry into the state, George and his wife Martha Washington, him the president at the time, rotated their slaves into and out of the state so that none would qualify for freedom. That's George Washington. Now, get this. Unless you really study history, like most people do not do when they're pulling down these statues, let's take the father of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas and Jefferson said, all men are created equal. And you're not going to believe this, but he also was the father of a number of children with one of his hundreds of slaves. Do you think Sally Hemings was free to reject a years-long sexual union with Thomas Jefferson, the man who owned her? No, back then, Thomas Jefferson wasn't perfect either. Now, since we're talking about history so much today, let's talk about the author of the United States Constitution, who also owned more than 100 slaves. Defend his exploitation of them into this presidency. This same James Madison, who artfully and articulately defended natural rights for white people, hardly considered blacks to be in the same category. Should we forget him too? I've changed the way that I write certain words in my novels. If you look back at some of my earliest novels, for example, you'll see I differentiated between the blacks and the whites by changing up the way that words sounded when blacks talked in my novels. I don't do that anymore. I may say they're black, but they will speak just like I speak, and you can read the words, understand the words, but no, I don't write like the people from way back when would write their novels. I've just totally changed. For example, how many have read books where the spelling accentuates a black person talking, or uses the words like Negro or darky in their stories? We all have come a long way since the attitudes and eras that permitted the most grotesque exploitation of human beings by others and the most hypocritical suppression of human worth in the Western world's history, slavery in America. Though it legally came to an end with the adoption of the 13th Amendment in 1868, slavery has had an afterlife almost as hateful as the institution itself. Now, talking about slavery, I will do just that after a quick word from my sponsor, and I'll be back with you. Have you heard about Anchor.fm by Spotify? It's the easiest way to make a podcast with everything you need all in one place. Yep, Anchor has the tools that will allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or your computer. And best of all, Anchor is totally free. Download the Anchor app or go to Anchor.fm to get started. And now for the rest of my story. I left off right before the commercial break with our looking at the adoption of the 13th Amendment in 1868. But wait, let's take a sidestep for just a moment. Just to let you know, especially those who don't know history, slavery didn't just exist for African Americans. It existed for any white woman who crossed the threshold and said, "I do." This is covered intensely in my 2-novel set, I Am Woman, Hear Me Roar, and the second book, I Am Woman, I Am Invincible. The afterlife of slavery has consisted of laws, customs, and attitudes intended to repress the lives and the liberties of African Americans. These repressions included Jim Crow laws, lynchings, and I could talk about a lot of lynchings that went on in Columbus, Texas, under the largest and oldest oak tree in the state. And what about forced segregation, which I myself experienced firsthand, denials of constitutionally guaranteed freedoms based on skin color, the Ku Klux Klan, and the post-World War II era. What is the common thread in slavery's afterlife? The use of our government for malicious purposes. Peaceful protesters are exercising constitutionally protected rights to expose government hatred and wrongdoing. Police officers can only use deadly force when they reasonably believe it is being used on them or another person. Even then, it can only be used proportionately to save a human life. For when used for any other purpose, it's criminal. And law enforcement officers who use it without legal justification should be downright prosecuted. There are bad cops, but there are so many good ones. But we can't reverse the memory of so much of our past, can we? We need to be reminded from time to time of that horrible past so that we can labor mightily to avoid us ever repeating it again. But does that mean changing the names of federal institutions? Or the names of our schools? Or changing the names of our NFL football teams? Or tearing down statues of the long dead? Because we finally realize that there was more evil than good in some of them. Or at least those who are not educated about past history think so. Or does it mean tastefully confining these statues and portraits to museums, an academic institution where those once considered great can be exposed? I do understand the impulses to knock these guys off their pedestals sometimes, but doing so runs the risk of rewriting history and acting as if they never existed. They did exist. So much history has been written about the good of people. And yet, if you go in and try to write the truth of some of these people, people will jump you from one end to the other. Take Custer's last stand. Was Custer a hero in his last stand? I won't go into the history, the true history surrounding Custer's last stand, but no, he wasn't a hero. And if I were to write that and speak that and talk about Custer's last stand, people, oh my goodness, they jump all over me for that. So we're not going to talk about Custer's last stand today. We also run the risk of demanding such human perfection as a precondition to erecting a statue of memory that only Jesus Christ himself could meet the standard. You know, there's not going to be any end once we start pulling down statues after statues. Whether or not it's Robert E. Lee in Richmond, Virginia, or, yes, it's happening, Christopher Columbus, the founder of our country, or even Theodore Roosevelt, for God's sake, the 26th President of the United States. Anyone who owns private property is free to display any opinion about any historical figure in any form on that property. The problems come about when the government does this. The late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia wrote that government itself has the freedom of speech. Nope. I disagree. People have the freedom of speech because we are born with it and other natural rights. Government is not a natural creature. It is an artificial creation. When a government acts as if it has freedom of speech, whose speech is it exercising? The power structure of those who control it? Don't take my tax dollars to advance your speech. Yet, pretending that these figures never existed, or eradicating the memory of the good they perform, will continue the march towards a false sense of place. One that's not based on what was, but on what the folks in power wish had been. That is a self-delusion that escapes all reality. We must live in the real world, where evil men did good things and good men did bad things. And intelligent people recognize this, don't we? Removing statues, and I have to talk about this. I talked about this on an earlier broadcast. My wife was taking an ethics course, and we were talking one day about a slippery slope. Just what was a slippery slope? Well, what I'm talking about today is such a thing. Removing statues is a slippery slope that could lead to the brash removal of monuments to any slightly problematic person. During the protests last year following the death of George Floyd in the summer of 2020, many Confederate statues were damaged or toppled, as were statues of the presidents George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and yes, General Ulysses S. Grant. Washington, Jefferson, and Grant had undeniable, no doubt, ties to slavery. Washington owned over 300. Jefferson, he owned over 600. And Grant worked on his wife's family plantation and inherited one slave upon his father-in-law's death. However, Washington led our soldiers to victory over the British, held together our country as the first president for over 2 terms, resisted attempts by new citizens of our country to be king of the states, and in his own free will, freed all of his slaves upon his wife's death. Jefferson is the author of 2 of our most dear principles as a country: equality and religious freedom. He was also an abolitionist, though a hypocritical and pragmatic one who understood the country would not give up to slavery so easily. he hoped the next generation would abolish slavery. Ulysses S. Grant, he came from an abolitionist family, freed the one slave he owned in 1859, supported all of the black enlisted army men, led the Union Army in the Civil War to abolish slavery, and was endorsed by Frederick Douglass for the President of the United States. Shouldn't we sit here today and honor the outstanding contributions of George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and Ulysses S. Grant to our United States because they owned slaves, as did many men of their standing at the time, even though they struggled with the institution? There is an essential difference between helping to create the United States and trying to destroy it. For God's sake, both George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were critical to the formation of our free country and to the shaping of it in the early years. No one puts a monument up honoring these two men for promoting slavery. I think on these two, Washington and Jefferson in particular, you take some of the bitter along with the sweet. The primary duty is not to hide our sour parts. 8 United States presidents owned slaves while in office, with 4 owning slaves while not in office. And get this, Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who were 2 women who were the mentors of the main characters in my 2 novels, I Am Woman, and the leaders of the white women's suffragists, ruled and excluded all black women. A noted black speaker in the 1960s, one that was regularly on television every time they had the news, cheated on his wife. Do we ban the achievements of these figures from our public display, or take them off the dollar coin because they displayed controversial behavior? Where is it do we draw the line? Do we protect Confederate graves and battlefields, or should we go and destroy all headstones that have the flag of the Confederacy on them? The line is subjective and difficult to draw and easy to reinterpret, which brings me to, now, get this. The fact is, no memorial is protected. Our government must stop immediately by giving in to all this destruction of our history. The slippery slope, we talk about it again. It goes even further, allowing anyone to destroy any statue they disagree with. For example, a statue of a black abolitionist back during the Civil War era, a former slave, his name was Frederick Douglass, was damaged last year about this time. As a matter of fact, it was on the July 4th weekend up in Rochester, New York. And then a statue of a black tennis star. His name was Arthur Ashe, and he was one of the greatest, or still is one of the greatest, tennis players of all time. His statue was tagged with White Lives Matter graffiti in Richmond, Virginia. And just yesterday, I saw the ending of the U.S. Open tennis match, where it was played in the Arthur Ashe Stadium. Do we now go and burn the tennis stadium down to the ground? So, you see, all this removing of our history has gone on just long enough. Let's learn by it. Let's continue learning by it. It's time to say We've learned so much about our history in history books to never let atrocities like what I've spoke about today happen again. But let's quit wiping away our history. Well, that does it. Hope you warmed up at the beginning. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining us this week on the Sidney St. James Show, a division of the Bebop Publishing Group. And if you found value in my show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or if you just simply tell a friend about the show, that would help us too. If you like the program, check out any one of over 50 great novels available in ebook, paperback, and on audio. Oh, and be sure to tune in next week, for our next episode is Jesus Christ, the only pathway to heaven? Till then, later, alligator. Well, that does it for me for another great episode from Sidney St. James. Be sure to click on the tab above that says send a voice message, and I will get it from you, and I'll probably play it back on one of my future podcasts. Also, don't forget to click the button follow. I'd love for you to follow my podcast. But it's been fun. I hope you enjoyed this episode. And until next time, here I am, Sidney St. James. Happy listening.